Today we're going to talk about learning and situational factors that play a role in criminal behavior. So there's three types of learning. There's classical conditioning, which is when we learn when our behavior is rewarded or punished. And biological factors play a part in individual differences in how we respond to classical conditioning. So if you think about like Pavlov's dog, that's classical conditioning. There's instrumental learning, which is where the learner must do something to the environment in order to obtain a reward, or in some cases to avoid punishment. And this is operant conditioning. It's learning the consequences of our behavior. Social learning is a little more complex. It's watching others, organizing their social experiences, and it's most representative of psychology. And there's quite a few social learning theories that are very influential in terms of criminology and explaining criminal behavior. Now, in 1913, Watson publishes Psychology as the Behaviorist Views It, and this is the official beginning of behaviorism. It looks at cognitive processes. These are our internal mental processes that enable us to imagine, to gain knowledge, to reason, to evaluate information. So you, again, think about Pavlov's classical conditioning experiment. There's a stimulus, right? And that's a person, an object, or an event that elicits some behavior. It could be unconditioned, which means the ability to produce salivation, right? So Pavlov's dog is conditioned that when a bell rings, he's getting a treat. Bell rings, he gets a treat. And eventually gets to the point where a bell rings and he salivates, okay? Now, an unconditioned stimulus is the ability to produce saliva is innate and did not depend on the dog having to learn the response. The conditioned stimulus is the dog quickly learns that the sound precedes the treat and therefore begins to salivate. Now, the response is the elicited behavior, okay? A conditioned response means that association was learned. Skinner has a theory of behavior that looks at environmental stimuli, and that's our independent variable. That's the some stimulus in the environment that's going to elicit behavior, and the behavior is the dependent variable. That's the behavior that gets elicited, okay? It acknowledges the presence of mental activity, but Skinner doesn't think that's necessarily relevant. Now, when thinking about this as a method of science, our behavior has to be publicly observed, and the data has to be comparable. We have to be able to compare it. Okay, so situationism is the idea that all behavior is at the mercy of stimuli in the environment, and we have virtually no control or self-determination. Reductionism says complex behavior can be broken down into simple behavior. We can reduce it. And complex behavior can best be explained by examining simple stimulus response chains in behavior. Now, some concepts for Skinner are operant conditioning, reinforcement, that can be positive or negative, punishment, and extinction. So let's look at these real quick. Okay, so we have two types of reinforcement, and then there's also types of punishment. So reinforcement can be positive. That means you introduce something that's positive whenever someone's done a behavior you want to see, and it increases that behavior. So this could be like, you know, if your parents gave you rewards for your grades and your report card. Negative reinforcement also increases a desired behavior, but it's the removal of some type of adverse stimulus following a desired behavior. Punishment decreases undesired behavior, and that could again be aversive or positive. Okay, so operant conditioning says that criminal behavior is learned and strengthened because of the reinforcements it brings. So in order to eliminate crime, we would have to change society through behavioral engineering based on scientific conceptions of humans. Now, this is a tall order. Antisocial behavior are already occurring, and they're not always obvious, and they're generally very complex, okay? Much criminal behavior is undertaken for reinforcement purposes, whether that's positive or negative. And that could be anything from like increasing your status amongst your peers, increasing self-esteem, feeling competent, or a lot of people engage in criminal behavior just for the thrill of it. Social learning is the idea that all behavior is learned, and it can be changed using those same principles by which we learn that behavior. And the emphasis here is on cognitive processes, thinking and remembering. We learn through our social environment, we observe, we listen to those around us, and this could either maintain pro-social behavior or criminal behavior. A person's performance level is based on that person's expectation that behaving in a particular way will lead to a given outcome, right? So you kind of get to know what the rewards and consequences of your different behaviors are and what they are with different people and in different environments. And so we will often behave according to what we expect to happen. So when we engage in crime, we expect to gain something from that, okay? That might be like a monetary gain. It could be a gain in status or power or security. Better living conditions, somebody's admiration or affection. Now, people who break the law perceive and interpret the situation and select what they consider to be the most effective. And so generally, we're learning from our past behavior. What has worked before? What behaviors have resulted in what consequences, whether those are positive or negative. Now, much of our behavior is learned by watching other people, models, okay? That could be on TV, but mostly it's people that you like and respect and admire and that are around you. Siblings, parents, role models, okay? They provide cues for us of how to do something, and this is sometimes called imitational learning. Now, the more significant the model is for us, the more we admire them, like them, respect them, the greater the impact they have on us. And it's less what the model says than what the model actually does, and whether or not we see that model being rewarded for their behavior. So I had a client once on probation, and he had an uncle or a cousin, I think a cousin, who was involved in the drug trade. And he was always saying to him, don't get involved in this. This is going to mess up your life. I don't want you to do this, right? Except what he saw visually was someone who always had nice clothes and always had money in his pocket. Okay. And so what you do and what I see, right, is often more influential than what you say to me, what you model, right? It's kind of the idea that actions speak louder than words. Now, differential association and differential reinforcement theories talk about specific mechanisms for how we learn. Okay. We learn to commit deviant acts through our relationships with other people, okay? So in criminology, we study this as Sutherland's theory of differential association. Differential association just means different relationships, okay? And we learn all behavior the same way, whether it's positive or negative. And we learn it in small, intimate groups. We don't go take a big seminar on how to make meth. You would learn that in a small, intimate group. You would also learn not only how to do something, but why you might want to do that. What are the benefits of doing that? And we also are learning, how do people see the law? Do they see it as a positive thing or a negative thing? And if we have more definitions of the law as positive, then we're probably going to follow the law. And if more of our definitions of the law are negative, then we're probably going to not follow it. Now, a lot of reinforcements, they don't have to be cold hard cash, actual tangible reinforcements. A lot of times it's symbolic or it's verbal. Someone telling us we did a good job, someone laughing at what we did, us entertaining them, okay? And that behavior can be reinforced by all the people in our lives that are important to us. They help us define what is bad or good. Now, discriminative stimuli are social signals transmitted by subcultures we belong to or our peers, and they indicate whether or not certain types of behavior are rewarded or punished and under what circumstances. So positive discriminative stimuli are signals that communicate that behavior is encouraged by the group. Okay, this is that principle of positive reinforcement. And then neutralizing or justifying discriminative stimuli neutralize the warnings communicated by society at large that something is inappropriate. Okay, so we might know something's inappropriate. Our larger culture has told us it's inappropriate, and neutralizing and justifying discriminative stimuli are basically like, everyone does it, it's okay. Now, the more people define their behavior as positive or justified, the more likely they are to engage in it. Okay, so if you're a crim major or minor, you know this as the actual principle of differential association. Now, sometimes our behavior comes about because of frustration. When we have behavior directed at a specific goal and that's blocked, okay, we experience a drive to reduce that. So a socialized offender has learned to expect rewards as a result of their interactions with their social environment. The individual offender is a product of long, intense series of frustrations resulting in unmet needs. This is kind of like strain theory. It's a little bit like that. Now, the more intense and frequent that frustration is, the more our goals, the things we're trying to achieve, get blocked, the more sensitive we become to subsequent frustration. Think of this like stress, right? You got one or two things, stressful things going on, you can kind of roll with that, right? What happens is then another thing happens and another thing happens. You guys have all had a day where by the end of the day, you're like, and the thing that kind of pushes you over the edge might be really small, but you're like, it's been nonsense all day. Okay? Similar idea, right? The more intense, the more frequent that frustration is. And it might lead people to have like a chip on their shoulder. Now, some things to think about here, okay? One is this idea called the fundamental attribution error. This is our tendency to discount the influence of a situation and instead explain someone's behavior by their personality, right? So it's where we sort of discount other things that might be playing a role and we're like, no, that's just Billy and he's just an a-hole, okay? We might also engage in self-serving bias. We tend to attribute, so bad things we tend to attribute to not be our fault. And good things we tend to be like, oh, cool. Like, I worked really hard and I deserve that, right? Now, another field we can study here when we're thinking about criminal behavior is to study victims, okay? And we do have a course on this called victimology. Well, it's victimology, but I think ours is called Society and Victims of Crime. And this is looking at what sort of things, whereas criminology and what we're looking at here is what causes criminal behavior, right? This is looking at what sort of things play a role in someone becoming a victim. It's not victim blaming. We're not blaming a victim. We're looking at how their actions might facilitate, precipitate, or provoke others to commit a crime. It's never their fault. The blame is always with the offender, never with a victim, okay? But it's looking at what kind of behavior might put someone at risk for victimization. This helps us learn how to decrease our risk for victimization. Now, sometimes people are engaging in criminal behavior as a result of some authority, okay? So there's crimes of obedience, right? These are acts that people perform in response to orders from an authority, even though the large community at large would consider these acts immoral or illegal. So you think about something like, why did so many Germans participate in the Nazi regime? Now, some obviously believed in that, but some didn't and still participated in that. What about stuff like what happened at Abu Ghraib, things that happen in military detention centers, right? How do we explain that behavior, okay? Milgram did a series of experiments that are kind of interesting, right? And hopefully you guys are familiar with this experiment, where he looked at, they gave some commands to people to provide electric shocks as a learning mechanism. Now, nobody's actually being shocked, but they think that people are being shocked. And they're telling them, like, the experiment must continue, you must go on. And 2/3 of people obeyed and administered the maximum shock level, even though it sounded like they were really hurting someone, okay? The closer the experimenter, so the subject of the research, the person doing the shocking, was to the subject, the more likely the subject was to obey. The nearer the experimenter, the person running the experiment, was to the person giving the shocks, the more likely they were to obey. Women seemed more distressed about the task, And many basically justified their behavior by saying, well, they wouldn't be letting this experiment happen if it wasn't okay, right? And by the way, the experiment took place at Yale, so I'm sure that influenced a lot of people, right? They're in like a science lab. You're at Yale. You probably figure like, Yale knows what they're doing. Now, 45 years later, they replicate this study. And by the way, this really like messed with people's heads. Really made them feel like, did some damage, because I think people were surprised to learn they would do that. And they found that the obedience rates were only a little bit lower. Now, there's a lot of controversy around these studies, right? They're deceiving the participants. They didn't adequately debrief them. So even when we deceive people that are in a research study, we often talk them through what happened afterwards. And then, obviously, I think that if you went into something thinking, well, I would never hurt people, and then you realized, oh, you kept like upping the shock level, that would probably mess with your head a little bit. Another concept that we can study here is de-individuation. This is our loss of individuality in self-imposed groups when we are in crowds or groups. Okay, so what happens when we're in a group? Okay, and either like groupthink happens, or there's a diffusion, a dispersion of individual responsibility. Okay. Now, Zimbardo does this famous study called the Stanford Prison Experiment, and there's a lot of problems with this experiment too. Zimbardo, a lot of ethical issues with it. Zimbardo basically had to be stopped from continuing it, and some of the results have probably been misinterpreted. But he basically gets some volunteers to play like inmates and to play guards, and to kind of see how the environment of a prison, a fake prison, impacts people's behavior. Okay. And basically, Zimbardo says de-individuation follows this chain of events. Okay. So first of all, when there's a lot of other people present, we kind of lose our anonymity, it encourages anonymity, right? Like I'm one in a crowd. Surely one of these other people would stop this, right? We lose our identity. We become part of the group. Okay. We feel like we can't be singled out as solely responsible for this. That can lead us to losing self-awareness, not really thinking about how other people might evaluate us. And these appear to be processes that happen when we see mass violence or looting, or if you have ever seen any of the videos of like, so in 2004 when the Red Sox reversed the curse, right, there was a lot of like people partying in Kenmore Square and people engaging in behavior. Knowing they're on TV, there's a million cops there. You guys might be familiar with like as you come off, I think it's Com Ave, right? And you go onto Brookline Street up by Fenway, right? There's a bank of ATMs with glass windows. People were like climbing the poles over there, trying to throw shopping carts through those glass windows. They know they're being filmed. They're on the news. Like I wasn't there. I watched it happen on TV. Okay. We sort of lose ourselves sometimes in a crowd. Now, true mob actions are rare, okay? But this negative collective behavior can affect and instigate and maintain violence and illegal activities, okay? Now, one thing that happens in a crowd is what's called a bystander effect. A lot of people will assume someone else is going to intervene. It's not my responsibility. And you see a lot of diffusion of responsibility. And I've seen this in small situations. I was on the Orange Line probably a decade ago. We're stopped at Haymarket. The doors are open. We're stopped there for a little while. It's father and son are on the platform, adult father and son, and they start getting into it and pushing each other. And now it's getting physical, right? And many people are just watching this happen, okay? I stood up to say something, and then all of a sudden everyone else stands up. But before that, everyone was perfectly happy to just sit there and be like, it's not my business, okay? We're going to do some reading about Kitty Genovese and how this led to Good Samaritan laws and 911 and how a lot of people sort of stood by while this happened, okay? You've probably seen this in your everyday life. I live on a main road, and I was sitting in bed one night a couple years ago, and I hear like screech crash, okay? And a young person driving a car had an accident, and their Jeep was like, not their Jeep, like their SUV was now on its side. They had pushed another car down the street, and the kid's trapped in there. Okay. I open my window to look outside to see what has happened. And there's probably 10 people outside on the street, all of them with their cameras out, no one calling 911. A bunch of them thinking they're going to be the hero trying to get the kid out of the car. Except they're shaking the car. They're rocking the car back and forth. They're trying to break a window that's not big enough to pull the kid out of. And as they're shaking this, right, he's not quite, I don't remember if he's upside down or he's on his side, right? They're going to do damage, right? Now, by the way, you should know the police department is around the corner from my house. Fire, public safety, ambulance, it's all in the same building. If you call 911 from my house, it takes about 5 minutes for a police officer to show up. I call 911. I'm yelling out the window to them, hey, 911 has said to leave the car alone. It's not like the car's on fire. It's not like there's not enough time for trained rescuers to get here, okay? But all these dudes are outside, and most of them are just standing there filming. And you guys have probably seen stuff like this, right? There's some kind of a diffusion of responsibility, as opposed to if it was just you alone, you might feel like, I'm the only person here, of course I have to respond. Now, moral agency is our ability as individuals to behave in a moral manner. It requires us to know right from wrong and refrain from doing the wrong thing. Moral disengagement looks at, why do people do things we know that are not right? Right? Like, we have all done things that we would agree in general are wrong. We probably all agree it's wrong to hit people. And I would bet that everybody here has hit somebody. Okay. If you have siblings, you've definitely hit somebody. Okay. How do we detach ourselves? Moral disengagement is detaching ourselves from our moral principles. Dehumanization, right? These are all ways that we're kind of like pulling ourselves away from moral responsibilities we have. This is where we're like, well, those people deserved what happened to them, right? We sort of strip people of human qualities and instead think of them as like, they're bad people and they deserve what happens to them. Now, Bandura has some strategic models of disengagement, right? Some is like, we morally justify our behavior. We're doing it for a greater good. There's people who attack, Planned Parenthood clinics. There was a doctor in the 80s here that was shot, and I don't remember I think they were killed at an abortion clinic, right? Because someone is saying like, oh, they're killing, even though what they're doing is protesting what they consider killing of babies, okay? We can also use our language to distance ourselves, right? So when a police officer shoots somebody, what it's often called in the news is an officer-involved shooting. If I shoot somebody, they're going to be like, Spencer shot somebody, right? But if an officer does it, it's an officer-involved shooting, okay? We often call people who get killed in wartime but are civilians collateral damage, okay? We compare things to other things that are worse. Oh, this isn't as bad as what other people are doing. So I burned down a sex offender's home, but he's a pervert, so like that's fine. We displace our responsibility, right? We say like we were ordered, I was told to do something. I'm just following orders. Okay? We diffuse responsibility. I'm not the only one who was there. Okay? Other people were there. Other people were involved in that. And finally, we might disregard, distort, or deny harm. So this denial of harm might sound familiar to those of you that have taken criminology, right? When we talk about techniques of neutralization, how do we justify behavior when we break rules we actually believe in? We don't think that any harm has been done, okay? Or we don't see that direct effect, right? No one's hurt by me evading taxes. Observers will often be like, that's not my business. I'm not going to get involved. Okay. And by the way, this was pretty much par for the course with family violence for decades. So when I was growing up, we started to learn more about abuse, child abuse, but people used to consider it like in domestic violence, but people used to just consider it like a private matter. It's not for me to get involved in. So you can hear your neighbor beating the crap out of their wife. You can hear her screaming and crying, but like, that's not my business. Okay. And dehumanizing our victim. So in techniques of neutralization for my CJ friends, that's like denial of a victim. The person who's harmed doesn't really count. Okay. We saw this with Luigi Mangione killing that CEO, right, of United Healthcare, right? Crimes like that. Okay. Jeffrey Epstein dies in prison. suicide, right? But what if that wasn't suicide? We don't really feel bad about that. We don't see that person as human.